Thank you again for the invitation. And I guess for those of you who've heard me talk about various aspects of this work, I should put out a disclaimer. There will be some repetition and there will be some very general bits of information because I wanted to make sure that we cover all bases and reach out to everybody in the audience, whether they're familiar enough or not with some of the things that I will be talking about. So if you do get bored, feel free to go out and have a walk around and then come back. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work I'm doing that is trying to unpick aspects of plant food cultures in the Paleolithic of Southwest Asia, and particularly the later periods. And currently my focus is sort of on trying to unpick aspects of protein-rich plant foods and their incorporation into diets of the later hunter-gatherers. And what I want to do is, I guess, and this is a sort of long-term aim of mine, is to try and unpick some of these opposing views of past food choices, but also the incorporation of plant foods into diets in the later Paleolithic. That seems to be to argue that, I guess, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers predominantly were after calories and nutrients and not necessarily enjoyment of food. And the technological side of cooking or getting these ingredients to be in a state that is actually useful in terms of what they bring to the diet, but also in terms of their other properties like keeping people fuller for longer, etc., don't necessarily factor into these arguments and the way we investigate and interpret past food choices, or as regularly as they could be. So I want to address this sort of opposing views of past food choices through archaeobotanical work that I do, which involves identification of essentially ingredients, so the plant components of these foods, but also aspects of the technology of cooking, because we tend to see these two things that somewhat are presented as disparate concepts or disparate steps, preserved together, especially in the kinds of remains that I work in. I specialize on carbonized plant macro remains, so these can be anything from bits of wood charcoal to bits of carbonized tubers. So these are the underground storage organs similar to sweet potatoes, but also various other things like seed coat fragments and stems and leaves, etc. If they survive carbonization, then and they are deposited at archaeological sites, chances are that I will at some point or other see them and work on them. And the techniques that we've developed over the years encompasses a wide range, but essentially relies on using modern reference materials to identify the archaeological. So I've got a couple of examples here if you're not familiar with what I will be talking about. Some of the other things that I will talk about throughout this talk, based on some of the work that I'm doing on the archaeological remains, as well as some of the targets of my experimental work, centers on this charred amorphous plant remains, or things, if you want to imagine them as carbonized pieces of breadcrumbs. So if you've got a toaster at home, and you ever clean the toaster tray underneath, you will see tiny bits of breadcrumbs that have been charred, turned into black soot-like pieces, and they are things that we actually find archaeologically as well. And I'm not necessarily the first person to work on these things. They have been identified and worked on from various sites across the regions that I work in, but also more broadly across the globe, especially in the last 2 decades. And they contain fragments of the ingredients, as well as some aspects of the steps that are involved in the preparation of these items before they're carbonized. And the way in which we normally get to them is through creating reference materials and experiments that allow us to unpick aspects of these remains and how they may be formed and deposited in archaeological sites, but they could represent single events. So preparation of one piece of food where lumps can fall into the fire accidentally, and or some sort of waste that is happening or being produced during the preparation can be chucked out, especially, if you think of how you might clean out bits of rice as you're preparing it to cook, and you see some that don't look necessarily too well, or in the process of preparing a recipe, something goes wrong and you chuck some of it out. These kinds of single events can produce similar carbonized remains. In later periods, when there is cooking vessels or pottery for the use of food preparation, bits of the food can fuse with the vessel or the preparation item to carbonize and preserve. And then other things can be stored in part prepared form, like things like bread rusks that are kept dry and stored for longer term. And if there's an accidental fire, things can carbonize and preserve for archaeologists to come and find. And in essence, we want to be able to understand what these things represent as products, but we're not necessarily able to see whole items or whole recipes or things that we can put names on foods unless we have complete remains preserved. But one thing we can do, even with the more routinely found pieces that will be breadcrumb size, is to look at the texture inside and homogeneity of ingredients, and whether there's a diversity of ingredients being included or not, and various other aspects. So often when we try to describe things, we describe them in a really boring manner because we are not necessarily able to imagine what the finished product may be like for sure, without taking a lot of leaps and making a lot of assumptions. And therefore, we don't necessarily want to get rid of potential diversity that existed in the past for aspects of culinary practices. But at the same time, there are some limitations as to what we can see from the fragments that we find. And so if you hear me refraining from putting certain words out, like bread or rice-like preparations, and that's the main reason. So why do I want to do this kind of work? And I want to give you a bit of the archaeological background before I go into showing you some of the examples from the archaeological side and what I'm trying to do to tackle aspects of it further through experimental design. One of the case study regions that I'm focusing on at the minute is the longer term sequences I have for later Paleolithic occupation in the northern Zagros. This is the Zagros mountain range in Southwest Asia that is bordering on the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, which is an important region for the transition of hunter-gatherers to early farming economies. And it is also a region that is it's one of the most important refugia for certain plant and animals that were domesticated later on, and is one of the biodiversity hotspots even today, despite increasing troubles with climate change and aridity. And one of the reasons why I am so keen to look at this region is it allows me to look at a long-term sequence of hunter-gatherer occupation through multiple episodes of climatic shifts and various changes in the environment that we know happened in the region. And I suspect one of the aspects of their subsistence that allowed them to be resilient and not necessarily more successful hunter-gatherers, but for sure able to occupy this region and use its resources to the best, is the fact that they have a very early record of reliance on certain types of plants from the middle and upper Paleolithic onwards. And one of the things that I'm investigating through these archaeological case studies is how does this change, and do we see any changes in various aspects of the way they use their plants? So just to show you some of the context from the sites. So the relatively well-known site of Shanidar Cave. I have stratified deposits from the Upper Paleolithic, also known as the Baradostian layers, as well as the Mousterian layers that are most commonly associated with the Neanderthal skeletal remains from the site. And from both periods, with work that is still ongoing, I see a relatively similar range of plants being relied on, including small and medium-seeded grasses, potentially some of them the ancestors of later domesticates, and definitely members of legumes that are progenitors or ancestors to later domesticated legumes. These include things like peas and vetches, as well as some fragments of what look like either underground storage organs or fragments of acorn nut meat, and potentially some fragments of the inside seed of nuts, but definitely shell from wild almonds and pistachia. Not too far away from Shanidar Cave, I have two sites that date to the Epipaleolithic period, so we're talking past the last glacial maximum, leading towards the beginning of the early Holocene. And from the first of these sites that had been re-excavated more, I guess, a bit earlier on in 2016-17, we were able to recover not too many in terms of density of fragments, but a relatively diverse range of things that seem to be actually marrying up with the evidence that we find from the Middle and Upper Paleolithic at Shanidar Cave. Again, with a diverse range of legumes and grasses, and definitely some of them the ancestors to the plants that were later domesticated in the region. One of the new sites that I'm working on in this part of the northern Zagros is the site Ashkartarash, which is along the same ridge as the Pelegara Cave, and seems to actually have a greater density of deposits that, or frequency of deposits that may reflect single-use events and in-situ deposits of things like small fire features. And for a site of this period in this region, it has a remarkable preservation of plant remains. Not all of them in fantastic condition, but often this is the case with epipaleolithic sites. In the region, things are not necessarily in huge densities, but and often broken up, but that just seems to be reflecting some of the technological steps that are frequently practiced. So as a result, you get plant remains that are bashed around and potentially processed partly. One of the interesting things is we are finding quite a lot of these charred plant aggregates at this site. And I have some examples, I think I will show in a minute, that we had already preliminarily published some from Shanidar Cave. So it seems to be a really good opportunity to be able to investigate not just the similarities in ingredients across the sites, but potentially the ways in which these ingredients are treated. So, as I said, there's a really good preservation and continuous horizon, potentially stretching to the earliest part of the Holocene. So some of these breadcrumb-like food fragments that we had found at Shanidar Cave, also at Frankly Cave, we published as a way to investigate whether we could get enough information out of them and what kind of things would be possible to work on these fragments. And the initial investigation revealed that quite a lot of these fragments are actually dominated by fragments of wild legumes, as well as some evidence for the incorporation of more carbohydrate-rich sources like tubers and grass seeds. Especially one of the fragments from the Mousterian levels seemed to, I guess, quite more clearly incorporate wild grasses with wild legume-rich matrix. And then there was some initial evidence that we could see where these yellow circles are, indicating the beginnings of gelatinization. So that is the sort of release of starchy contents of the seeds through agitation and heat exposure that starts to form a gloopy mix. So the way you would make falafel bowls or any kind of dough, as things start to become sticky and form into a mass, you start to see gelatinization happening. And it doesn't necessarily have to have boiling level temperatures, but some agitation and a bit of an increase in the sort of temperature would help to get to this stage. So we could see aspects of the ingredients, and these actually appear to be what defines plant staples for this region. These are the nuts and legumes contained within quite a lot of the food fragments that we have seen, and not too many have been investigated at the minute, because hopefully we can back this up with more experimental work before we go back to the archaeological material and continue investigating. But there's clearly a reliance on protein-rich sources. These are things like nuts and legumes, as well as things like wild mustards, because much to my surprise, they actually do contain quite a high percentage of proteins in the seeds, even though they're not very large. But then again, things like chia seeds or quinoa are not very large seeds either, and they have different kinds of properties. So it's not necessarily inconceivable that things like mustard seeds may have been targeted for their high protein or high oil content in this case. And these seem to be defining the Eastern Fertile Crescent or Northern Zagros sites in terms of the plant resources that are being targeted. Much of this, actually, these ingredients require multiple steps of processing. So they do need to leach either toxic or unpalatable compounds. And de facto assumption there is that there must be, and there likely is, but as suggested through the carbonized fragments, associated technologies, special and potentially region-specific cooking technologies that are developed to be able to render these items edible. So it gives us the potential to investigate some aspects of the origins and region-wide knowledge exchange that relates to cooking with these kinds of plants. And in this situation, it seems to be predating anything that involves cooking with grasses and starch-rich resources in this specific region. I'm not necessarily sure if it applies everywhere, but it gives us an opportunity to try and track it through time. So quite a lot of my experiments that I will give you some examples of in a minute are targeted towards understanding some of these carbonized food remains, which, as I said a bit earlier, allows us to understand the combinations of an ingredient, but as well as potentially some of the steps that are used in the preparation of these things. And we might also be able to get to things like rare additions to food, which could be seen as flavorings, and flavor is one of the defining elements of culinary cultures. So there's potentially quite a lot of things that we might be able to understand this. And one of the things that me and my colleagues are doing is also undertaking a structured systematic review of the literature to understand if our experimental approach is actually in line with whatever else has been done so far, and what other things that we are there that we need to do to try and understand this. So some of our initial results is showing that the majority of the case studies actually focus on things like grasses or things that are in the grass family as ingredients. There are far fewer studies that actually look at things like legumes or wild mustards, etc. There's a bit more work on wetland brushes and tubers, various things like oak acorns, members of the rose family and things like hazel. But there's a little disparity in terms of reporting how to replicate experiments and how the choice of ingredients can be justified. So one of my aims going forward is going to be trying and expand the sort of range of ingredients that are used, as well as trying to incorporate a broader range of recipes. And this kind of builds on the sort of earlier experimental work that has looked at things like beer making, in later periods, things that are deposited almost as complete items like bread-like objects and various other things, as well as looking at some of the earliest Neolithic meals that are based on cereals, even though they do go into identifying various other things. And there is, as I said, work being done on other wild items like wild wetland tubers, as well as some limited work that has been done on various legumes, though in this situation, most of the focus is looking at whole legumes and on a slightly more macroscopic scale than what I've been doing so far. So what I've been doing to date is to try and do controlled time soaking experiments to see whether certain features develop sooner or how quickly they can be observed, and what are the impacts of things like carbonization on the visibility of the features that we may be able to use archaeologically. So it's quite basic at the minute. And then there are aspects of how easy it becomes to process the remains depending on the pre-treatment. So soaking and roasting, or just roasting, or not treating at all. What kind of impact does that have in terms of the mechanistics, in terms of the cognition of preparation? So how quickly do you feel now you're done grinding something or crushing something? These are the kinds of variables that I've been trying to tackle, alongside being mindful of recording things that we might be able to use as archaeological correlates. So I've got examples here of the three, I guess, extreme ends of the matrix types that I'm trying to keep separate. So on the left-hand side is from soaked, thick-skinned chickpea that is whole, so it has its skin on within the matrix. In the middle is whole, thinner-skinned lentil with its skin incorporated in. And then at the very end is from split pea, where the skin has been husked out so that the soaking has been done just on with the seed. And it results, these three different types result in completely different types of texture. In terms of the grinding ease and formation of a lumpy product, let's say, the difference is not massive, but one of the things that changes is the texture of the prepared item is completely different, where on the left-hand side you have a much more fibrous and chewy product. In the middle is something that is a bit more medium in terms of chewiness, still quite a lot of fiber incorporated, and then something that does not feel necessarily as fibrous and definitely much softer in texture, baby food style, but again, at the same time, is using similar ingredients across. And we can see the differences of these on the uncarbonized as well as the carbonized fragments. And in fact, there are aspects of it that become quite easy to pick out once things become carbonized. So we can definitely measure these and quantify them and hopefully build robust criteria to be able to apply them to archaeological case studies. But before we get to that, we start to see certain signatures that we can expand on to be able to actually say certain things like legume seeds or nut seeds may have been soaked before carbonization. And this starts with various fissures that are developed on the seed coat. And it's just very basic mechanics, I suppose, of just water entering through the seed coat. But soaking before any kind of agitation or pounding or grinding is done results in a slightly different matrix that is the sort of inside of a patty, let's say, that will have slightly different composition in terms of variability of fragment sizes that are incorporated. And we can also see a difference if something has been crushed before it was introduced to water or any kind of soaking or boiling, as opposed to something that was soaked before it was mashed or agitated to form into a broken up matrix. So yeah, so generally there's a lot of potential, and I'm working through with various other colleagues to develop criteria that we can pin down so that we can start measuring more on the experimental material and then turn back around and start applying some of these things to the archaeological to see actually, can we unpick any minute differences that happen or any developments that are added on to the technology of cooking as people become more and more reliant on using various things like wild legumes or nuts, and whether multiple steps can be detected as easily as just tracing through one step. As I said, generally, we try to test everything to see if carbonization has a massive impact on how things are preserved. And at the minute, even the surface level differences we're seeing on seed coat does not seem to be massively altered with the introduction of carbonization into the mix. But we're trying different temperatures to see if that makes a massive difference or not.